Welcome to Fractured Chaos.
They say women who grow up without a father tend to seek older men. Maybe that's why I fell so hard for him. Maybe that explains why I ignored all the warning signs. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the truth I was about to discover. The kind of truth that doesn't just break you, it ruins you, shatters everything you thought you knew about yourself, your past, your future. My name is Monica, and this is my story. I should start by saying I never felt like I belonged. Growing up in a small town where everyone knew everyone's business, I always felt different. My mother raised me mostly on her own. The man I called Dad was distant, cold, there, but never really present. I used to catch my mother looking at me with this strange expression sometimes, like she was seeing someone else in my face. I left for college the first chance I got. Freedom tasted sweet. No more whispers behind my back, no more feeling like an outsider in my own home. I threw myself into my studies, determined to build a life that was entirely my own. I was never into guys my age. Too immature, too reckless, too temporary. I wanted stability, security, someone who knew exactly what they wanted from life. And then I met Nate. It happened at this little coffee shop just off campus. I was buried in textbooks, finals week looming, when he walked in. Something about him commanded attention. The confident stride, the way his presence seemed to fill the room. He was wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, salt and pepper hair perfectly styled. Our eyes met across the room, and I felt this electric current run through me. He was reading an actual printed newspaper. Who even does that anymore? When I caught myself staring. He smiled, and just like that, we started talking. I liked the weight behind his words, the way he actually listened when I spoke. Not just waiting for his turn to talk, but really hearing me. "You're different," he told me that first day. "Most people your age are so distracted. You know what you want." I did. And increasingly what I wanted was him. Our age difference, 20 years, raised eyebrows, but I didn't care. If anything, it made him more attractive. Nate had lived. He had stories, experiences, a certain worldliness that men my age couldn't compete with. When we were together, I felt seen, understood, safe. Within months, I was spending every night at his penthouse apartment. He cooked for me. God, the man could cook. Introduced me to fine wines, took me to theaters and restaurants I could never afford on my own. It wasn't about the money, though. It was about feeling valued, cherished. When he proposed 6 months in, I didn't hesitate. The ring was vintage, a family heirloom he said had belonged to his grandmother. It felt right on my finger, like it had been waiting for me all along. "We'll have the kind of life most people only dream about," he promised, sliding the ring onto my finger. "You and me, Monica. That's all I need." 2 weeks later, I found out I was pregnant. I was terrified. We'd been careful, but apparently not careful enough. I paced around my apartment for hours before calling him, rehearsing what I'd say, bracing myself for disappointment or worse, rejection. But Nate, he was ecstatic. "A family," he whispered, holding me close. "I've always wanted a real family." Something in the way he said it struck me as odd, like he'd been searching for something his whole life and had finally found it. But I was too relieved, too caught up in the moment to question it. That's when my mother insisted on meeting him. "If this man is about to be your husband and the father of my grandchild, I need to know who he is," she said, her voice unnaturally tight when I told her the news over the phone. I agreed. After all, I was proud of Nate, proud of the life we were building. What was the worst that could happen? We arranged to visit my childhood home for Christmas. I was excited to show Nate where I grew up, to merge our worlds together. He seemed nervous on the drive there, which I found endearing. This powerful, confident man, anxious about meeting my mother. "She's going to love you," I assured him, squeezing his hand. How could she not? But when my mother opened the door and saw Nate standing beside me, something happened. Something I'll never forget. She didn't just freeze. She changed. The color drained from her face so rapidly I thought she might faint. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. And her eyes, they widened with something that looked disturbingly like recognition. Nate's reaction was stranger still. Confusion at first, then a flicker of something in his eyes. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly, and his hand tightened around mine until it was almost painful. My mother recovered first, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome," she said, her voice unnaturally high. "Please come in." The tension followed us inside like a physical presence. My mother moved mechanically around the kitchen, preparing dinner, stealing glances at Nate when she thought I wasn't looking. Nate seemed distracted, responding to my attempts at conversation with one-word answers. That night, I excused myself to use the bathroom and heard hushed voices coming from the kitchen. I crept closer, heart pounding. "This can't be happening," my mother was saying, her voice thick with emotion. "Of all the men in the world—" "I had no idea," Nate responded, barely above a whisper. "You never told me. How could you not tell me?" I stepped into the room then, unable to bear the suspense. They jumped apart like guilty teenagers, both wearing identical expressions of shock. My mother let out a forced laugh. "Oh, honey, we were just catching up. Turns out Nate and I knew each other a long time ago. Small world, isn't it?" The explanation was plausible enough, but something felt wrong. Very wrong. That night, sleep evaded me. I tossed and turned beside Nate, who was pretending to be asleep but whose breathing gave him away. Questions swirled in my mind, keeping me awake until the early hours. The next morning, I went searching through some old photo albums while everyone else was still sleeping. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for my mother's reaction and the whispered conversation. And then I saw it. A faded Polaroid tucked behind another photo. My mother, much younger, standing next to a man whose face was partially obscured by shadow. But there was something about him, the set of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, that seemed hauntingly familiar. I showed the picture to Nate later that day, trying to keep my tone light. "Doesn't this guy look kind of like you?" I expected him to laugh it off. Instead, his face paled, and he stared at the photo for what felt like an eternity. "Where did you find this?" he finally asked, his voice strained. "In an old album. Why? Do you recognize him?" Nate handed the photo back to me carefully, as if it might burn him. "No, just curious." He was lying. I knew it with absolute certainty. That night, while Nate was in the shower and my mother was asleep, I did something I never thought I'd do. I went through her dresser drawers, searching for something. Anything that might explain the strange undercurrent I felt. In the bottom drawer, beneath layers of neatly folded sweaters, I found a small wooden box. Inside was a bundle of old letters tied with a faded ribbon, and beneath them, my birth certificate. I'd never seen it before. My hands trembled as I unfolded the document, scanning the information. My name, my birth date, my mother's name and signature. And there, where my father's name should have been, a blank space. The man who raised me, who I'd called Dad my entire life, wasn't my biological father. The realization hit me like a physical blow. If he wasn't my father, then who was? A terrible suspicion began forming in the back of my mind. One so horrific I tried to push it away immediately. But once the thought took root, I couldn't dislodge it. I waited until the next morning when Nate left to pick up some groceries. My mother was in the garden, pruning roses like everything was normal, like she hadn't been keeping secrets from me my entire life. "Mom," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "I need you to tell me the truth." She looked up, squinting against the morning sun. "About what, sweetie?" I held up the birth certificate. Her face crumpled, the secateurs falling from her hand onto the ground. "Where did you get that?" "It doesn't matter. What matters is what's not on it. Dad's name isn't there." I took a deep breath. Who is my real father? She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Monica, please, not now." "Yes, now, I'm engaged, I'm pregnant, I deserve to know." For a moment, I thought she might refuse. Then her shoulders sagged and she looked suddenly older, worn down by the weight of whatever she'd been carrying all these years. "I never wanted you to find out this way," she whispered. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Find out what?" The sound of a car door slamming in the driveway interrupted us. Nate was back. My mother's eyes darted toward the house, panic written across her features. "Mom," I insisted, grabbing her arm. "Tell me, now." She looked at me, really looked at me, her eyes filled with a lifetime of regret. Nate, she said finally, her voice hollow. Nate is your father. The world stopped spinning. Everything around me faded as the words echoed in my head. Nate is your father. Nate is your father. I felt sick. I stumbled backward, nearly falling as the full horror of what she was saying crashed over me. The man I loved, the man I was going to marry, the father of my unborn child, was my father too. The back door opened and Nate appeared, grocery bags in hand. He took one look at us, my mother crying, me standing there shell-shocked, and knew. His face drained of all color. The bags dropped to the ground, oranges rolling across the patio. "What's going on?" he asked, but his voice suggested he already knew. "Tell him," I said to my mother, my voice a stranger's. "Tell him what you just told me." She couldn't speak, just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Monica!" Nate took a step toward me, concern etched in his features. The features I'd admired so many times. The features I now realized with sickening clarity I saw in my own reflection every day. "She says you're my father," I said, the words tasting like poison. Nate froze. For a split second, I saw confusion in his eyes. Then shock, disbelief, and finally, horror. Pure, unadulterated horror. He hadn't known either. "No," he whispered. "No, that can't be." But even as he denied it, I could see the realization dawning on him. The mental calculations, the timeline coming together in his mind. "How?" He turned to my mother, his voice breaking. "How is this possible? You never told me you were pregnant." She wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold herself together. "You were already gone. You'd taken that job overseas. I was married to Robert by then. I thought it was better this way." Better. The word hung in the air between us, obscene in its inadequacy. A sharp pain suddenly ripped through my abdomen. I gasped, doubling over. Both of them turned to me, momentarily united in their concern. "Monica?" Nate reached for me, but I recoiled from his touch. The pain intensified, and I felt something warm and wet between my legs. I looked down to see a spreading crimson stain on my jeans. "Oh God," my mother whispered. The pain became unbearable. The world tilted sideways, and I was falling, falling, falling. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was Nate's face, contorted with anguish, reaching for me. They say the truth sets you free, but they never tell you what happens right after. The moment it tears through your life like a hurricane, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. The moment you realize that the love you built, the future you dreamed of, was never real, that it was always doomed from the start. I awoke to the rhythmic beeping of hospital machinery. My body felt hollowed out, an empty shell. The room came into focus slowly, stark white walls, the antiseptic smell, the IV drip attached to my arm. My hands instinctively moved to my stomach, flat, empty. The baby was gone. Grief hit me with such force I couldn't breathe. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I couldn't cry. The loss was too immense for tears, too all-consuming. I wasn't alone in the room. Nate sat in a chair by the window, his large frame somehow diminished. He looked up when he heard me stir, and the raw pain in his eyes mirrored my own. "Monica," he started, his voice rough from what must have been hours of silent anguish. I turned away. I couldn't look at him, couldn't bear to see the face I'd once loved, now forever transformed in my eyes. "Don't," I whispered. "Just don't." He stood anyway, moving closer to the bed. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I had no idea." A bitter laugh escaped me. "And that makes it better?" "No." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "Nothing makes this better, but I need you to know that what I felt for you, what I still feel, it was real." I shook my head, disgust rising like bile in my throat. "What you feel is wrong. What we did was—" "I know." His voice broke. "God, I know." The door opened, and my mother entered, looking like she'd aged a decade overnight. She carried a small overnight bag, which she placed carefully at the foot of my bed. "The doctor says you can leave tomorrow," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I brought you some clean clothes." I stared at her, this woman who had raised me, who I thought I knew. Why? It was the only word I could manage. She sank into the chair Nate had vacated. "I was young, stupid. trapped in a loveless marriage with a man who barely noticed me. Nate was different, exciting. When it ended and I found out I was pregnant, I panicked. Robert and I had been together around the same time. I convinced myself the baby could be his. I wanted it to be his. But you knew, I accused. Deep down, you knew. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. As you grew up, it became more and more obvious. You have his eyes, his smile, the way you tilt your head when you're thinking. She glanced at Nate, who stood rigid by the window before looking back at me. I told myself I was protecting you, protecting all of us. But maybe I was just a coward. Days blurred together after that. I was discharged from the hospital with pamphlets about grief counseling and physical recovery. The doctor explained in gentle terms what had happened, the trauma, the shock, the body's response. Medical terms for a broken heart. I couldn't stay in that house, surrounded by the wreckage of what had once been my life. I rented a small apartment on the other side of town. Nate tried to help, financially, emotionally, but I shut him out completely. I couldn't bear to see him, couldn't reconcile the man I had loved with, my father. My mother called every day. Sometimes I answered, mostly I didn't. What was there to say? The betrayal ran too deep, the damage too extensive. Weeks passed. I dropped out of college, unable to focus, unable to care about grades or deadlines, or a future that suddenly seemed meaningless. I spent my days in a fog, going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. And then, one gray Tuesday afternoon, something shifted. I was standing at my apartment window watching rain streak down the glass when I realized I was tired. Tired of hurting, tired of hiding, tired of letting this tragedy define me. I picked up the phone and called a therapist from one of those pamphlets. Made an appointment. It was a small step, but it was something. The healing was slow, excruciating. Some days I felt like I was drowning in grief, for my lost child, for the relationship I thought I had, for the life I'd planned. Other days, anger fueled me, at my mother for her deception, at Nate for his ignorance, at myself for not somehow knowing, sensing the truth. 6 months after that fateful Christmas, I received a letter from Nate. Inside was a check for an amount that made my head spin, and a short note. This can't fix what happened, but maybe it can help you start over. Somewhere new. I'll always be here if you need me, but I understand if you don't. I'm getting help. I hope you are too. I stared at the check for a long time. Then I deposited it, applied to a university on the opposite coast, and packed my bags. Before I left, I visited my mother one last time. She'd aged visibly, grief carving new lines into her face. We sat in the garden where the truth had first come out, the rose bushes now in full bloom. I'm leaving, I told her. I need space, time. She nodded, reaching for my hand tentatively. I let her take it. Will you ever forgive me? I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the woman who had lied to me, but the young, frightened girl she must have been all those years ago. Making impossible choices, living with unbearable secrets. I don't know, I answered honestly, but I'm going to try. I never saw Nate again. Sometimes I wonder what became of him, if he found peace, if he managed to rebuild his life from the ashes of our shared tragedy. I hope he did. Despite everything, I can't bring myself to hate him. He was as much a victim of my mother's deception as I was. They say women who grow up without a father tend to seek older men. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's why I fell so hard for Nate. But I've learned something else too. The past doesn't define you. Your mistakes don't define you. What defines you is how you rise from them. My name is Monica, and this isn't the end of my story. It's just the beginning of a different one.